Okay, so we're going to begin by looking at the reign of Elizabeth and what England was like in 1558. Now, throughout the different topics that we're going to look at on this PowerPoint, I've put a list of 3 things there that I want you to try and consider, as well as the additional information that I'm going to be giving you. So what the problems were that she inherited and what you think the greatest problems were at home domestically and also abroad in terms of foreign policy. And the third thing, which I always go on about, but which is really important to think about, which is any change and continuity that you see in Elizabeth's reign compared to the previous leaders that we've looked at already. Okay, so in terms of the population, I've put some statistics there which highlight this population increase. By 1601, you can see that the population in England has increased quite dramatically. Now, this is in contrast with previously under the early Tudor period and prior to that, where there was a population decline that was associated quite heavily with the impact of the Black Death. Now, it's worth noting that even in terms of population increase, the population of England is still relatively small compared to England's international rivals. So in 1500, France had a population of about 15 million and Spain had a population of 12 million. So although it is increasing, it is still relatively small. In terms of people living, the majority of people, roughly 90% of people, lived in the countryside, and 3/4 of them were south and east of a line between the River Severn and Humber. Basically meaning that the northwest of the country was relatively underpopulated compared with the Midlands and the southeast, and this is obviously going to be linking to things like the economy and trade and agriculture. At the start of the 16th century, London was the only substantial town with a population of around 60,000, and this rose to 215,000 by 1603. So by the end of Elizabeth's reign, London had really grown in its size, and the closest rival to London was Norwich. So in terms of the economy, starting off by looking at agriculture, over half of England used a system of the open field system, and what this meant was that an inevitable result of that was the enclosing and engrossing of land, which, as we know already, was a source of grievance amongst the Tudor people, with one of the best examples being the Kett's Rebellion, and that being one of the sort of key causes of its outbreak, led by Robert Kett. And then throughout the Tudor period, Tudor governments sort of looked at the causes and the problems around enclosure and tried to either prevent it or to regulate it in some way. So it's a really good example of a problem across the Tudor period, but it is important not to over-exaggerate it and to overplay its significance. The sort of recent research shows that between 1500 and 1600 there was only as little as 3% of total land which was actually enclosed. But nonetheless, it was obviously a very visible grievance and attracted a great deal of attention by the Tudor government as a result of peasants' grievances. In terms of industry, by far the most important English industry in the 16th century was the production of woolen cloth. In some parts of England, mainly Gloucestershire, Wiltshire and East Anglia, the cloth industry was a major source of employment, and cloth made up approximately 4/5 of English exports. Most of it was channelled through London to the port of Antwerp, which is in modern-day Belgium, until 1551, where it was used by the Flemish finishing traders. But the decline of Antwerp as a port meant that finding fresh markets for English cloth became a major consideration from 1551 onwards. So Elizabeth inherited the following rights. She could choose all her servants and ministers, both in her household and in her council. She had the right to approve or refuse any policy and policy initiatives suggested to her. Thirdly, She had the right to assent or to reject any legislation from Parliament. And finally, decisions on war and peace were all finally hers. In terms of the church, both Henry VIII and Edward had claimed supreme headship of the Church of England, a claim that Mary, as a devout Catholic, readily surrendered. Elizabeth followed her father's lead, but she didn't use the title in quite the same way, as we'll look at in more detail. The Crown also ensured ordinary revenue, so this was mainly made up of receipt of custom duties, rents from Crown lands, and feudal payments such as the sale of wardships. It was accepted that in peacetime the Crown's ordinary revenue should be enough to meet his expenditure. However, in the event of war, Parliament would have to vote the extraordinary revenue needed to meet for additional costs. Because of the Anglo-Spanish War from 1585, Parliament met much more frequently in the final 18 years of Elizabeth's reign than it did in the previous 26. So the Privy Council had evolved from the Great Council, a large, ill-organised group made up of prominent nobles and clergy, which were summoned at the monarch's discretion on particular issues. And it was during Thomas Cromwell's secretarialship that a recognisable Privy Council first began to operate. The Privy Council by Elizabeth was much smaller and more tightly defined body, and in Elizabeth's reign its membership fluctuated between 19 members in 1559 and 13 members in 1601. Senior churchmen were often included. Examples include Stephen Gardiner under Henry VIII and Mary, and Elizabeth actually broke with this practice until 1583 when John Whitgift, the Archbishop of Canterbury, with whom she had a lot of sympathy, became a member of the Privy Council. The Privy Council met on a regular basis, 3 or 4 times a week in the 1560s and daily in the 1590s when the country was at war. And the responsibilities were quite far-reaching, so the management of finance, the enforcement of religious conformity, defence, foreign policy, the maintenance of international security, and the regulation of economic affairs. The Privy Council could also act as an informal court of law, and it also had the authority to use torture to extract information, and this was actually used 53 times during Elizabeth's reign. In terms of Parliament, it had an essential role both in the passing of legislation but also in the voting for taxes. Parliaments were summoned automatically at the beginning of every reign, and thereafter they were summoned at the discretion of the monarch. In a reign of 44 years, Parliament was only in session for 126 weeks, an average of 3 weeks per year, and its importance really rested in terms of taxes. Every one of Elizabeth's parliaments voted for subsidies except for the parliament that was summoned in 1572, where no subsidy was requested. Parliament also passed large numbers of bills. Some of these were promoted by the Privy Council, which were public bills, and others were promoted by individual members of Parliament, private bills. And in the course of Elizabeth's reign, 272 public bills were passed, along with 166 private bills, and therefore Parliament played a crucial role in the national affairs, even if it was not yet part of the day-to-day machinery of government. So we know that the church was hugely significant for the monarch, but also significant for the people of England. And that previously, between 1529 and 1558, England had experienced 3 major upheavals in the beliefs, forms and practices of their form of Christianity. So under Henry VIII, there's obviously four big changes that took place. Henry broke with the papacy. The Pope's authority was replaced by that of Henry. Between 1536 and 1539, all the religious orders in England were dissolved. And fourthly, the Bible was translated into English, and a copy was placed in every parish church. Now, because of the Pope's refusal to grant him a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Henry broke with the papacy. The process took several years to accomplish, but the key stages were achieved between 1533 and 1536. Under the Act in Restraint of Appeals to Rome, passed in 1533, Henry abolished the Pope's right to intervene on any matter affecting the English Church. The Pope's authority was finally ended in 1536 by the Act extinguishing the authority of the Bishop of Rome. In the Act of Supremacy, passed in 1534, Henry and his successors were to be, quote, taken, accepted, and reputed the only supreme head in the Church of England. Insofar as the Act was passed by Parliament, it could be argued that Henry's power over the Church rested on Parliament's approval, and this was to become a critical bone of contention in Elizabeth's reign. In terms of dissolving the religious orders, this change reflects the power now gained by Henry VIII over the Pope. Between 1536 and 1539, all the religious orders in England were dissolved and their possessions annexed by the Crown. Some 7,000 monks and 2,000 nuns were forcibly removed from their religious houses, though most of the monks received pensions or employment as clergy. Henry's motives were primarily financial, but he was also concerned to eliminate an important source of opposition to the royal supremacy. Neither he nor Thomas Cromwell had any sympathy for the monastic ideal, and as a consequence, the Crown acquired an increase in its real estate together with the rental income to be derived from monastic lands. Now, obviously, this should have left a financially strong crown, but unfortunately for Henry's successors, much of this wealth was spent in Henry's excessive wars against France in the 1540s. By 1547, almost 2/3 of monastic property had been sold off, mostly to neighbouring landlords. It's worth bearing in mind, therefore, that those people that purchased the monastic land had a vested interest in resisting any re-establishment of monasticism under Mary Tudor, because there was potentially damaging impacts for them. Finally, in terms of translating the Bible, the final significant religious change affected in Henry's reign was this translation, and it was the requirement of one of Cromwell's injunctions of 1538 that a copy should be placed in every parish. The original intention had been to make the Bible accessible to everyone, but actually in 1543 an act was passed to restrict Bible reading only to the upper and middle classes. Now, such an act could not easily be enforced, and such evidence suggests that actually it had little impact. But once the scriptures were available to read and draw inspiration, it meant that there was a problem that rival interpretations of specific terms and extracts of the text could actually fuel religious discontent. The final years of Henry's reign witnessed then a confusing series of religious initiatives. In 1539, Henry introduced the famous Act of 6 Articles, designed to ensure that the English Church retained many of its Catholic features. Clerical marriage was forbidden, and confession was approved. Most importantly and famously, though, was the doctrine of transubstantiation was made compulsory, and denial of this actually resulted in the death penalty. There's lots of confusing evidence in this period, Henry sent 3 Catholics in the last few years to his reign to be executed, and he had 3 Protestants burnt for heresy. The last of his wives, Catherine Parr, whom he married in 1543, had strong Protestant sympathies. So by Henry's death in 1547, though the break with Rome and royal supremacy was clear, the actual path where the church was heading was not particularly clear. This changed under Edward. There was a rapid shift towards more Protestant church. Edward was only 10 at his succession, so under the Protector Somerset and then the Duke of Northumberland, both men were sympathetic to Protestantism, and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was given a relatively free hand to shape an Anglican church along the lines that he wished. The first English prayer book in 1549 was introduced, and the Act of Uniformity passed in the same year made the use of the new prayer book compulsory in all churches. The Act of Uniformity was generally observed, though there were some strong adverse reactions to this in Devon and Cornwall, where rebellions broke out, often referred to as the Prayer Book Rebellion. And it was clear that the rebels wanted a return to traditional Catholic practices, and those refusing to do so would die as heretics. A number of Protestant theologians were welcomed into England during Edward's reign, most notably Peter Martyr, and it's no doubt that he and others had an influence on the second prayer book, which was introduced in 1552, and this drew a more distinct and explicit line between the Anglican Church and the Catholic tradition. At communion service, the use of vestments, which was the garments worn by the clergy, was forbidden, and a simple table was to replace the altar. Another key change was taken in terms of the wording of the use of and the administration of the bread and the wine. And this controversy became known as Rubric, or later Black Rubric, in terms of giving the bread and the wine too much adoration in the services. Edward's reign also saw a further attack on the church's material wealth. Under the Chantries Act of 1548, all chantries, free chapels, colleges, hospitals, fraternities and guilds in England and Wales were assigned to the Crown. Now these changes were obviously reversed under Mary. As daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Mary was both a devout Catholic and proud of her Spanish ancestors. She was determined to restore England to the Catholic fold and to marry Philip II, the recently widowed King of Spain. In her first parliament in 1553, Mary secured the repeal of all the Edwardian religious legislation, though 80 MPs out of 350 opposed the appeal of the Act of Uniformity. In her third parliament, which lasted from November 1554 to January 1555, all the anti-papal legislation since 1529 was repealed, and the heresy laws came back. In November 1554, Cardinal Pole arrived from Rome to become Archbishop of Canterbury and Papal Legate. Now, Cardinal Pole had opposed Catherine of Aragon's divorce and had left England in 1536. As Papal Legate, he was given authority to restore England to the Catholic Church. In February 1555, religious persecution began. Mary herself urged the strict enforcement of the heresy laws, and at least 282 so-called heretics were burnt at the stake between February 1555 and November 1558, and a further 40 died in prison. Among those who were killed were some of the most famous, with the bishops Ridley, Latimer, Hooper and Cranmer. Now, in terms of contextually and the amount of burnings that were taking place, her persecutions were not outrageously harsh, and certainly her father had been equally ruthless with his Catholic opponents, but the scale of the burnings was quite unprecedented. And one of the things that came out was the courage with which the victims met their end. Now, what this did was this gave Protestantism a sort of moral standing that it had previously lacked. And now this was furthered by the skill by the propagandists John Fox. Now, Fox's famous Book of Martyrs was first published in England in 1562, and it soon became a bestseller. And the English government, or Elizabeth's government I should say, encouraged the provision of a copy in all cathedrals and churches. Alongside that, the death of bishops and of the bishops of Ridley, Latimer and Cranmer became famous and well known and retold in part of the English folk culture, and all of this did a lot to fuel anti-Catholicism and build a very negative and damning portrayal of Mary. Something which further added to Mary's unpopularity in terms of her religion was her marriage to Philip of Spain. Now, the Spanish marriage had dire consequences as it led directly to one of the rebellions of the reign known as Wyatt's Rebellion, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt in January 1554. Mary's marriage also involved England in a wasteful war with France, which saw the loss of the coastal town of Calais, England's last continental possession. Due to the fighting which Philip II had with Pope Paul. Some 800 Protestants had fled to the continent and were now determined to return, many of them strengthened by their views of John Calvin, his followers became known as the Calvinists. The great majority of the English people had kept their heads down, but religious allegiance varied greatly from one part of the country to another. In Cornwall, men rebelled at a new prayer book. In London and the home counties, they died because they would not accept the Catholic faith. So it's important to understand that across the country, there was not a clear picture of people's religious allegiances. Okay, so let's look just briefly at the relationship with England and Wales, Scotland and Ireland. The Tudor dynasty obviously had strong links with Wales. Henry VII had landed at Milford Haven in 1585 to launch his bid for the throne, and this may have helped to reconcile the Welsh to an English rule. Cromwell was anxious to integrate Wales more closely into England, and by two significant acts of Parliament, firstly in 1536 and then in 1543, Wales acquired a political system which was similar to England. In terms of the Reformation, it was met with relatively little opposition in Wales, which proved naturally receptive to Protestant ideas. Thus, compared to other parts of the realm, Wales gave little difficulty to Elizabeth, and though the Welsh language and sense of identity survived, at this stage cultural differences didn't prove to be a serious conflict for Elizabeth. In terms of Scotland, under Henry VII, he had treated his fellow monarch James IV as an equal and was glad to arrange the marriage of his eldest daughter Margaret to the Scottish kingdom. The two kingdoms had remained on reasonably good terms throughout Henry VII's reign, but with Henry VIII's succession, the matters changed. Any war with France, which was certain to take place because of Henry's motivations to be successful with war in France, meant that relationship with Scotland were fraught due to the traditional alliance between France and Scotland. By the end of Henry VIII's reign, relationships with Scotland were particularly bad. In 1544, Henry ordered Edward's uncle, the Earl of Hertford, who was then to become Protector Somerset, to invade Scotland and destroy Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, plus every house and village within 7 miles of Edinburgh. And when Hertford became protector in 1547, he embarked on the most ambitious of Tudor's policies towards Scotland. Somerset's aim was very clear. He wanted a permanent conquest of Scotland, and he invaded with a large army and won the Battle of Pinkie and established garrisons in the borders. However, this policy wasn't successful. It was hugely expensive and was far too expensive for them to maintain. Therefore, the policy of integrating Scotland into England had been a failure previously. In terms of Ireland, Tudor policy towards Ireland prior to 1558 was ambitious and also very unsuccessful. At the outset of the Tudor period, English authority was effective only within a narrow coastal strip on the east coast, known as the Pale, which you can see there on the map. And the rest of Ireland was ruled indirectly through the Earls of Kildare. In 1534, the 8th Earl was summoned to London and then imprisoned in the Tower, and this sparked off the first of many rebellions against Tudor rule. It was successfully suppressed, and Henry and Cromwell decided the aristocratic delegation should be replaced by direct rule, direct control within Ireland. Henry's plan for direct rule of England is seen in 1541, when Henry changed to be, instead of Lord of Ireland, as King of Ireland, his title, and this was partly because of the fear of the Pope's authority, that people in Ireland would prefer to support the Pope than to support the King, and this led to actually further complications. Whereas in Scotland, a spontaneous native Protestant Reformation was about to occur. In Ireland, the bulk of the population, the aristocracy, as well as the peasantry, remained committed to the Catholic faith. Attempts to impose a Protestant church in Ireland for the majority was doomed to fail. And therefore, while the Reformation brought England and Scotland more closely together, in Ireland it actually had the opposite effect. Both the papacy and Spain offered their support to Elizabeth's Catholic opponents in Ireland, and therefore, as her reign progressed, Ireland became an increasing worry and one of the greatest burdens on her financial resources. So in terms of foreign policy, Henry VII had pursued, for the most part, a very realistic foreign policy. He tailored it towards England's needs and the resources that it required. He sought foreign recognition of his dynasty by marrying his children into other royal houses, for example, Arthur and Catherine of Aragon. And he married his first daughter, Margaret, to James IV of Scotland, and his youngest daughter, Mary, to Louis XII of France. Henry VIII, by contrast, wanted to extend England's possessions on the French coast, and in his most ambitious moments actually to renew England's claim to the French throne, and he fought 3 wars against France, usually as an ally to Spain, and the only tangible gain really was Boulogne, which in 1550 was actually given up anyway. Somerset continued Henry's anti-Scottish and therefore anti-French policy in 1547, and Mary came to the throne, and as a result of her marriage to Philip II of Spain, in 1557 joined war against France, which as a result actually led to the loss of Calais. The other thing that's worth noticing is obviously that after the English Reformation across Europe, there was always the danger for Elizabeth that Catholic powers of Europe might unite against a Protestant threat.